Welcome back, class. We will now begin a review of some of the supplemental material for Chapter 12, Titchener, Introspection, and Positivism. We'll be looking at Wundt and Titchener. Remember, Titchener is a student of Wundt. Once he established that laboratory in Germany, a lot of people who had interest in psychology would flock to him and get educated under him. We'll also examine some notable facts dealing with Titchener. We'll look at structuralism and then compare structuralism to functionalism, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. Then we'll look at stimulus, error, and illusions, some of Titchener's views, and then give a quick assessment of things beyond structuralism, and then do a review, summary, and some quick points. So here you can see a comparison of Wundt and Titchener sort of at a glance. Both agreed that the focus should be on immediate experience. Titchener saw the consciousness as the sum of mental experience at any given moment, and mind is the accumulated experiences of a lifetime. The goal was to determine the what via introspection to catalog all conscious experience, the how do the elements combine, and why, the search for the neurological correlates to mental events or of mental life. Actually, with Titchener, in 1896, he sort of outlined psychology. 1898, a primer of psychology, and then created experimental psychology manual lab for lab practice, which stimulated growth of lab work in the U.S., influenced generations of experimental psychology, and also had a great deal of impact in the early stages of the field. Titchener also developed the experimentalists, a sort of group, club in a way, that only had men, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Remember, at this time there wasn't quite a bit of women in the area of psychology, even though we do see a few of them appear in some graduate programs. But Titchener was known to be somewhat accepting of women in psychology graduate programs. One-third of his doctoral students were women. One of them you're familiar with is Margaret F. Washburn, the first woman PhD in psychology, wrote an important book of the comparative psychology, first woman psychologist elected to the National Academy of Science, and a president of the American Psychological Association. What is structuralism? Well, structuralism is an approach that seeks to analyze a complex reality into its components. It seeks to find the fundamental elements upon which structures are built and understand the interrelations between these elements. It is the approach of Wundt and Titchener, okay, this idea of structure. Later in psychology, the second half of the 20th century, this approach has also been used in cognitive psychology, especially in psycholinguistics and in artificial intelligence modeling. It is also used in a version of psychoanalysis that analyzes the consciousness as a language system. Those modern names in psychology structuralism, one you're probably very familiar with, and that's Jean Piaget. So the idea is about the structure of things. So as we saw with Jean Piaget, it was the cognitive structure of things, how it is that we develop cognitively from a young person to an older person, going through the early stages of developing the way in which we think to the more abstract ways that we could think a little bit later in our development. So the key thing here was the structure of these particular mechanisms. Now, doing a quick comparison of these two things here, because usually in intro text we start off with structuralism and then move quite quickly to functionalism. Now, functionalism looks primarily at the role behaviors and thoughts play. It does not ask the question of the composition of thought or behavior or their structures. In psychology, the functionalist question often is, how does this behavior, this thought, etc., help the organism adapt? Another area that we saw Titchener's experience want to examine, psychology. For Titchener is about conscious experience from the perspective of the person who is actually experiencing it. So let's look at time, for example. He was not interested in objective time, how much time passes, but he was interested in how it was experienced. And just to give you an example here, you know how it is. Sometimes 1 hour seems longer than another, though objective the reality they're the same. So it depends on a variety of things, what your interest is in the subject matter, who's with you, and so an hour can pass differently from our experience. An hour can be brief if we really enjoy what's going on, or an hour can be a really long time if we don't have that much enjoyment. So he was interested in that aspect of it. What were they actually experiencing? Now, just to clarify how this works, let's talk about the idea of stimulus error from Titchener's perspective. Well, stimulus error confuses the mental process with the object we are observing. Psychology says Titchener observes the experience, not the mental process, not the stimulus. So the idea, if we look at this graph, or this image here to the side, we have this red thing with a stem coming from and a leaf attached to it. It's an apple. Okay, but he would not want you to respond to it as an apple. He would want you to look at truly what were you experiencing. The apple is your perception of what is there. He didn't want to go there yet because that involves a lot of different types of things as to what type of apple and your previous experiences with all this type of stuff and so on. What he was looking at was the conscious elements. So you describe and you break it down into these elements of crisp, cold, sweet. Okay, those were the things that he was interested in. What you are experiencing. Another example of this, to some extent, would be the observing of illusions. It's a good way to differentiate between object and the mental experience. So, with the moon illusion, okay, we have one on the left side and one on the right side. The one on the left side is a moon that appears way off in the distance. But on the right side of the image, we have this moon that appears closer to us. But obviously, it is an illusion. That's not what's really going on. Well, obviously, the moon appears bigger when it's closer to the horizon. And so our experience of what it is and its size differs from the reality of it. It is merely an illusion of its size. So the idea here is that we need to understand that what we're seeing is not always actually what is there. In a very similar fashion, this notion of stimulus error. Now, again, as we saw at the very beginning of this section here, Titchener started with a complex experience, what we are actually experiencing at the moment that we're experiencing it, and tried to reduce it to its smaller parts. So he was deconstructing that experience into its elements. So the idea there would be that we would be able to ascertain in some fashion the structure. Wundt, on the other hand, tried to make synthesis from smaller parts. So he was putting things together, creating a synthesis, as opposed to breaking them apart, which was Titchener's perspective. Titchener thought observers could operate like machines. They were like measuring instruments. Similarly, people were viewed as machines. Elements combine automatically as we experience these things. Titchener was seeking to try to catalog a bunch of information. Titchener identified approximately 45,000 individual sensation qualities, of which about 33,000 were visual, about 12,000 auditory. Each sensation quality could vary in intensity, duration, clearness, and sometimes extensity, having extension. And then we had affective states, could vary in quality, intensity, and duration, or more emotional types of things. In later years, Titchener gave up his idea of these elements to think in terms of dimensions. Dimensions, think of it as a single aspect of a given thing, and elements are part of something. So dimensions, a single aspect of a given thing. So by 1920, he was shifting toward a more phenomenological approach, and that may be where he would have ended up had he not died in 1927. So here with phenomenology, an approach that concentrates on the study of consciousness and the objects of direct experience. Not that different from what he was already believing, but he was looking again at direct experience. Titchener's structuralism was not very sophisticated in the sense that he was not reflected upon the nature of structure itself, upon the relation of the terms within each other. Other structures built systems and think more carefully about the relationship of the elements with each other, but it was not the focus of Titchener's work. As we talked about earlier, Titchener did have a lot of uh, interest in, I guess, in the progression of women in this area of psychology. So he did display some conflicting behaviors toward women. Although he had many graduate students who were going to be psychologists, but he did not allow them to participate in a group that he established called the experimentalists. So he did display these conflicting behaviors toward women. He would not allow women to join his group, the experimentalists. However, his first doctoral candidate was Margaret Washburn, who was the first woman to receive her PhD in psychology. Quickly. Structuralism's goals and methods. The goal of psychology were the determination of the what, how, and why of mental life. The what was learned through introspection, the cataloging of the basic mental elements that make up the conscious experience. The how answered the question of how the elements combined. The why involved the neurological correlates of mental events. He only sought to describe mental experience or the structure of the mind. Therefore, the school was called structuralism. Now, process of introspection was more complicated and required more of the subject than Wundt's. Introspection in Titchener's laboratory required the subject to describe the basic, raw, elemental experiences which form complex cognitive experience. So we have this complex thing that we are experiencing, and his subjects were trained to break them down. You know, as we thought about that, saw that apple, we'd break it down to crisp, cold, sweet, those types of things, the elements, okay, not the complete package. He wanted sensations, not perceptions. If in the report the subject responded with the name of the object rather than the elemental aspects of the stimulus, then the subject committed what he referred to, as we saw earlier, stimulus error. Mental events. Well, elements of consciousness, the mind, were sensations, elements of perceptions, images, elements of ideas, and affections, elements of emotions. The elements could be known only by their attributes. Attributes of sensations and images were quality, intensity, duration, clearness, extensity. Affections have attributes of quality, of intensity, and duration. Titchener did not agree with Wundt's tri-dimensional theory of emotions that we talked about previously. Emotions were described in terms of one dimension, pleasantness and unpleasantness. Law of contiguity. He described how the elements combine by using the law of contiguity, as many others have done before. The context theory of meaning. What gives meaning to sensations is called the context theory of meaning. What gives sensations and events meaning is the images and events with which the sensation has been associated contiguously in the past. So again, these associations form a core or a context. And if we see these things happen together, we are sort of developing an understanding and a meaning behind them. Neurological correlates of mental events. He believed that physiological processes provide a continuous substratum that give psychological processes a continuity they otherwise would not have. Although the nervous system does not cause mental events, it can be used to explain some of their characteristics. Decline of structuralism. Well, the decline of structuralism was inevitable as people began to question the use of introspection as a viable method in research. Again, you recall that from your intro psych class. It comes across quite strongly in intro books about introspection not being a very objective way to do things. So that was in part one of the reasons for the decline of structuralism, as people began to question its use of introspection's use. Other factors which contributed to the decline, well, we had the development of the study of animal behavior. Obviously, when it comes to introspection, we can't get introspection from animals, for one thing. And animal behavior, once they began studying that, they had data and more concrete, objective things that they were collecting. Then we have the other item that was a part of the decline of structuralism, the lack of interest in practical implications on the part of structuralism. They were not interested in applying this to anything. There was no applicability to it, and therefore there was no use for the common everyday person or even the scientist here to use this for something. So we have the development of the study of animal behavior and the lack of practicality that we saw with structuralism. And then the development of behaviorism and objective methods of research. This was another major blow to structuralism, because now we have this new area of behaviorism, which, as we will see a little bit later, became not only a school of thought but a movement, a major wave within the area of psychology. And let's wrap up just reviewing some of the quick points that we've covered here. The content of conscious experience, the subject matter of psychology is conscious experience, as the experience is dependent on the person who's actually experiencing it. It's dependent on the experienced individual. Other sciences, independent of experience of persons, like temperature, consider phenomena in terms of human observe and experience these phenomena, how we experience light and sound. We have this notion of stimulus error, confusing the mental process with the object we are observing, trying to avoid that. We have immediate versus immediate experience, where we have the immediate experience, color, brightness, and shape, the immediate experience, other than color, brightness, and shape, where we are interpreting the object. Again, the immediate experience is going to be the color, the crispness, the sweetness of the apple, and the immediate experience is us interpreting all those other sensations earlier in the immediate experience, and we interpret it, we perceive it. That's the immediate. The consciousness was seen as the sum of experiences as they exist at any given time. The mind, the sum of our experiences accumulated over a lifetime. Introspection or self-observation relied on trained observers reporting the elements of their conscious state. Trained observers. It should be pointed out now that then, in the early stages of psychology, when they were doing introspection, these individuals were not what they refer to as naive subjects. They were far from naive. They were highly trained individuals, trained to observe. The elements of consciousness define three essential problems for psychology: reduce conscious process to the simplest components, determine laws by which elements were associated, and connect the elements with their physiological conditions. And finally, the aims were the same as those of the natural sciences. He proposed these three elementary states of consciousness: sensations, the basic elements of perception; images, the element of idea, memory of past experience; affective states, the element of emotion, love, hate, and sadness, and so on. So that covers some of the basic key items I wanted to address for Titchener in the early days of psychology in chapter 12.